Hi everyone, I'm Sylvie.
And I'm Dylan, and this is the Doc Talk episode covering female identity and roles in 1920s society.
So in this episode, we hope to teach you the significance and the value of women's roles in 1920s and their impact on society today. We're first going to take you back to the 1920s. We'll describe the time of Virginia Woolf, a leading female figure whose literary perspective exhibited feminism.
She also conveyed a strong female voice in 1920s, which was a male-dominated society at the time. Woolf emphasized the pressures of society that limited women. She often referred to the female existence as something that's overlooked in American society, something that's not appreciated.
So one of Woolf's most impactful pieces was published in 1929. It was during an active women's rights era. The novel A Room of One's Own had an explicit quote that first caught our attention. For most of history, Anonymous was a woman.
The silencing of women's broad voice and their contribution to the nation's success was exhibited by Woolf's quote.
So we're first going to talk about what influenced the women's rights movement in the 1920s.
So jazz music was a propelling force in the women's liberation movement in the United States during the 1920s. The music provided females of all ages with an outlet for rebellion. Jazz music helped to provide jobs for women within the music industry and expanded the base of female careers.
So women had been the largest faction of supporters for the ratification of the 18th and 19th Amendments. Prohibition and the suffrage movement were almost completely pursued by women's organizations, such as the participation in the NAACP and the League of Women Voters.
Yeah, so the 19th Amendment declared for the first time that they, like men, deserve all the rights and responsibilities of citizenship. It opened up other issues that women face in discrimination, such as workforce, education, etc.
So the legacy of the 19th Amendment turned out to be complicated. It advanced equality between the sexes, but left intersecting inequalities of class, race, and ethnicity intact. While it did stimulate important policy change, it also left many reform goals, such as prohibition, unachieved. So the 19th Amendment helped women, above all white women, find a new stance in government agencies, political parties, and elected offices. And in time, they could even run for president.
Yeah, but the 19th Amendment was hardly the end of the struggle for diverse women's equality. It became a crucial step, but only a step in the continuing quest for more representative democracy. One of the ways women fought was through the evolution of fashion.
Yeah, so in the 1920s, women's fashion began to evolve. Women wore less jewelry and less extravagant clothing. Simplicity was the driving trend of women's fashion of the 1920s, with the development of convenient and modern styles that rejected formality and conformity.
Yeah, and women wanted to be viewed more as people, less like moms or maids, but like people who could work and be on the same level as men. They wanted to be treated as individuals, not dependents of men, and through this desire, women began to climb the social ladder. So this leads into our next topic about the female expectation in the 1920s and how it differs now.
The 1920s was an age of prosperity. It forged a wider social spectrum than ever before. However, the 1920s proved challenging for American women. Women were expected to raise children, keep house, provide emotional support for their husbands, and in complex ways contribute to American society. Women worked primarily as factory workers, laundresses, typists, salespeople, clerks, bookkeepers, dressmakers, and housekeepers.
Yeah, and even though the 1920s offered new employment opportunities in industries previously closed to women, often the women who took these jobs found themselves exploited. No matter what her social standing, race, or level of education, the new woman found the 1920s a time of uncertainty. For the poor, being a new woman meant new burdens, not opportunities.
So the new woman who chose to combine domesticity with a career had to experiment with new ways to manage her time and energy to meet the demands of being a wife, mother, and working woman. Substantial number of women took up the challenge of a career or job outside of the home.
Yeah, and sometimes women persevered to overcome barriers and gained admission to professions such as law and medicine. Others took up jobs such as work in textile mills that were readily offered to women. The passage of the 19th Amendment was a first step in the liberation of women during the 1920s. After the sacrifices of the war years, young women wanted to break free from the restrictions of the Victorian age.
So during the 1920s, employment of women increased by only 1%, and they were still employed largely in lower-paying service jobs. Society now accepted that women would be independent and make choices for themselves in education, jobs, marital status, and careers. Women's spheres had broadened to include public as well as home life. The new woman was on her way. So this brings us into our next topic about how 1920s women's rights activism compares to women's rights today.
So the new woman resisted traditional controls, thus forging the women's right to vote movement. The movement was successful and the right to vote was ratified.
Yeah, so 3 years after the ratification of the 19th Amendment, the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, was initially proposed in Congress in 1923 in an effort to secure full equality for women.
Yeah, and it sought to end the legal distinctions between men and women in terms of divorce, property, employment, and other matters. However, the ERA failed to achieve ratification.
So, overall, in the 1920s, the feminist movement affected change in Western society, most specifically women's suffrage. So, women's suffrage in the 1920s focused on greater access to education, more equitable pay with men, the right to initiate divorce proceedings, the right to own property, and the right of women to make individual decisions regarding their body, specifically pregnancy, and including access to contraceptives and abortion.
Yeah, and by the early 20th century, it was estimated that thousands of women were undergoing illegal abortions each year, and that hundreds were dying from botched procedures. Abortion didn't become legal till 1970s. Now, 50 years later, abortion is illegal in most of the states due to the fading of Roe v. Wade. Women still to this day fight for their ability to choose, which was taken away last year for many women across the U.S. Similarly to the 1920s, women still fight for education opportunities, equal pay/treatment at the workplace, and more.
So now, across the globe, many women and young girls still face discrimination on the basis of gender. Gender inequality undermines many problems which negatively affects women and young girls, such as domestic and sexual violence, lower pay, lack of access to education, and inadequate health care.
So this brings us into our next topic about how the negligence of reproductive health care education affected female health in the 1920s.
So, in the 1920s, progressive activists fought for women's rights to help eliminate the lack of sexual freedoms. The birth control movement forced Americans to open their eyes and see the need for contraceptive devices and educational info pertaining to their own bodies. Birth control meant freedom for women.
Yeah, but in the 1920s, a federal law made selling contraception illegal, along with contraceptive advertising and any form of birth control information.
So, religious and moral beliefs also intersected with economic and social class factors and hindered the promotion of contraception. Okay, so dozens of birth control clinics attempted to open across the U.S. during the 1920s. However, in 1929, New York police raided a clinic and arrested 2 doctors and 3 nurses for distributing contraceptive info that was unrelated to the prevention of disease.
Yeah, and the lack of reproductive health care education greatly affected female health and knowledge about their own bodies. The negligence of healthcare denied women the right to know how to take care of themselves, be healthy, and know what the basic bodily functions are.
So it actually wasn't until the late 1960s and 1970s that the women's health movement actually began to surge. The movement's primary goal was to improve healthcare for all women.
And despite setbacks in the area of reproductive rights during the 1980s, the WHM made significant gains in women's health at the federal policy level during the 1980s and 1990s.
So what later became known as sex education, the values and lessons changed in many ways over the years, and the sex education during the 1920s was quite different from the sex education taught in most schools today.
So women played a significant role in shaping and influencing American literature. They challenged traditional gender roles, wrote about the experience of women, and helped to shape the literary landscape of the time.
So the male-dominated society contributed to the silencing of women, specifically in the literary perspective.
Yeah, and various techniques were used to silence women when they complained about sexism or other problems pertaining to their experience. The silencing uses intimidation that discourages women from speaking out and targeted women who did speak up.
So silencing of women, especially in literature, was used to dismiss or deny the legitimacy of women's speech.
Virginia Woolf shows the silencing in her quote, "Anonymous was a woman." The quote also shows how women were silenced and ripped of their vital identity and voice.
However, this didn't stop women from writing. They wanted to maintain anonymity, shield their reputation, make money, avoid a sexist lens being cast on their work, receive an honest criticism of their writing, or to explore topics deemed inappropriate for women.
And Virginia Woolf, the pioneering female novelist, was remembered to be one of the most bold modernist classic writers as she raised the question of why women cannot be independent.
So, given the era she comes from, women were always taught to be submissive in nature. However, female youth culture in the 19th. So this leads into our next topic about how youth culture affected female identity in their fight for equality in the 1920s.
So many young people, especially those living in big cities, embraced a new life that was much more rebellious than that of previous generations.
So in these big cities, instead of reverting to the modesty of the Victorian era, women ditched their corsets, cut their hair short, and so the flapper was born. Rebellious and determined, flappers flirted, danced, smoked, and frequently attended speakeasies.
Yeah, and flappers who were young women were seen as brash for wearing excessive makeup, drinking, treating sex in a casual manner, smoking, driving automobiles, and otherwise flouting social and sexual norms. They challenged the previously accepted norms of society in every regard.
So flappers set the stage for a much more liberated view of women's sexuality, in that they made it so women would no longer be considered impure, immoral, or dangerous for engaging in everyday casual activities.
Yeah, and despite female rebellion, many still face discrimination such as low pay or the refusal to do hard labor.
So the post-war materialism and consumer capitalism, two essential elements of the flapper culture, along with the Jazz Age, paved the way for the flappers to emerge as modern women who would play a key role in leading the rise of pop culture.
Yeah, and eventually, youth culture paved the way for greater individualism and the rejection of established institutions and led to a cultural revolution that shaped the time's social, political, and artistic landscape.
So this brings us into one of our last topics about female roles in the economy. We're going to answer why women today are more inclined to take on leadership roles than they were in the 1920s, and how it reflects the changing female identity in the workforce.
So, in the 1920s, women's lives began to evolve and less women conformed to their society, and women found their lives changed more than appearance.
So now, society accepted that women could be independent and make choices for themselves in education, jobs, marital status, and careers. Women's spheres had broadened to include public as well as home life. Today, women make up more of the workforce than they did in the 1920s. Women's progress in terms of economic power and education has accelerated. Women now receive the majority of bachelor's, master's, business, law, and medical degrees and greatly outnumber men on college campuses.
Yeah, and women hold a majority of professional and manager positions in American businesses. So, in 2019, for the first time, women comprise the majority of America's college-educated workforce. Women are also increasingly starting businesses of their own, and in 2018, there were 12.3 million woman-owned businesses. So, in 1920, 8.2 million women were working, representing 20.3% of the workforce, while in 2018, there was 78.6 million women working, representing 47.3% of the workforce.
So today, women are more inclined to take on leadership roles due to the increased freedom and their ability to take stance in a more dominant economic position.
And despite the rigorous fight for equality, most of 1920s women were still subject to their stereotypical positions due to the lack of representation and career opportunity.
So, since the 1920s, female identity has changed due to increased opportunity within their society. Ultimately, women are essential to the success of society. Women bring unique perspectives and solutions and bring talents and life experience. So this leads us into our final topic of our Doc Talk, where we're going to answer how the lack of representation for women affected the lower class system and the female experience in American society.
And on some levels, the 1920 suffragists would be gratified to witness the tremendous power that women wield as elected officials, candidates, community leaders, and voters. Yet there are still fewer women in Congress, governorships, and other halls of power. This is mainly due to the strict stereotypes still placed onto women today.
So, this stereotyping of women is not what the 1920s suffragists fought for. Men are not lectured about needing to vote one way or another merely because of their identity as a male.
And the suffrage movement meant to give women equal rights not just to vote, but to make up their own minds and freely express their opinions. That's a right that we need to continue to fight.
So in the 1920s and even now, the lack of representation of women in governmental positions or just higher economic positions in general makes young girls feel limited, as if it's not possible for her or any other girl to be in that type of position of power. Young girls can feel like they can't achieve their dreams solely because of their gender.
And another way women were limited was the pink tax, a tax on female products. Young girls in poor families had a harder time paying for women essentials, such as pads, tampons, razors, shampoo and conditioners, feminine clothing, and other necessities a woman needs in life. Many girls don't have the access to these products, which can become detrimental to their physical and mental health.
So that's all we have for today for this episode of Doc Talks, and we hope this inspired you to learn about women's activism and possibly make your own impact today. We also urge you to take a look at Woolf's famous essay, A Room of One's Own, where we got our quote about anonymous women in the 1920s. We thank you for listening in.